Hello, everyone. So we're here to talk about Consultancy Agile. Agency Agile has a better ring to it, but it turns out there's a company called Agency Agile and trademarked it. So we're going to call it Consultancy Agile. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we have modified Scrum to work in a client-facing environment, and I will explain what I mean by that in a moment. So real quick, my name is Todd Nienkerk. I am a digital strategist and partner at Four Kitchens. We're in Austin, Texas. You can reach me here if you have any questions. Please feel free to shoot me an email. Closer. Hello. All right. Feel free to shoot me an email, follow me on Twitter, whatever. Sometimes I talk about project management stuff, business development. I talk a lot about no RFPs and alternatives to RFPs. Most of the stuff on Twitter is a bunch of really bad puns, so just brace yourself. Okay, here's the problem that we're going to try and solve. Scrum was designed for products and internal teams and stakeholders. But consultancies work on projects with external teams and stakeholders. So let's talk about Scrum Classic. Scrum Classic is all about products. So you might work at IBM or Google or Apple or someplace where you are trying to ship something, where you have a shippable product, a potentially shippable product at the end of a sprint. All the jargon around Scrum has to do with products, so there's a product owner, it's very product focused. It's internally facing, and what I mean by that is if you're at an IBM or a Google or an Apple, everybody on the team and everybody who is invested in the product is also at IBM or Google or Apple. So it's IBM working on their own product with their own teams, with their own time, with their own money, and their own people. Right? Also, stakeholders tend to control all of the resources. So a company knows we have 10 people. If we need more people, we could put 12 people on it. If we need less people, we can take some people off. If we need more time, well, there are going to be consequences, but we have to deal with the consequences ourselves because it's our product and our team. So the stakeholders are able to better control the resources, the scope, and the budget, which are three of the key things in project management, obviously. And of course, in Scrum Classic, it's done when it's done. But consultancy Scrum, it's done when we say it's done. That's coming from the client. So when you're a consultancy, you are working on a project, not necessarily a product. It is externally facing. So you, as the consultancy, are doing project management. You are responsible for the outcome. But you are having to manage your own team and at least one other stakeholder or multiple stakeholders that are outside of your team that may or may not actually be invested in your process. So the vendors control the resources, not the stakeholders, meaning the people at your client's company. Problem is, all they care about is that it's done on time and on budget, and they don't really care how you do it, right? They are not invested in your process, they are invested in the outcome, and they only want to spend a certain amount of time and a certain amount of money. So we noticed that this was a big issue. We first started using Scrum when we worked on the Economist.com migration project. The Economist did something really interesting. A lot of people have this impression of The Economist magazine as something that's very dry and kind of uptight, but it is in fact not really the case. If you've ever read the captions on the photos, you know that they do have a sense of humor. It is very British, but they do have a sense of humor, and they are really wonderful, forward-thinking people. They're very, very progressive in how they handle their business and their technology especially. They did something really interesting and very radical. 5 or 6 years ago, they decided that they were going to adopt Scrum, not only for all of their tech projects, but also for management. So they had their management teams do Scrum with Scrums and do product owner training and understand that they fully understood that in order to do Scrum well, they had to do Scrum everywhere. So it wasn't just the tech team or the web team, it was the management and all of the POs. So we had a really good introduction to Scrum. That was the first Scrum project we ever worked on, and based on that, we have run every project ever since according to Scrum and Agile methodologies. So I'm going to talk about how it's done in Scrum Classic, and then how we do it in Consultancy Scrum. And I want to save some time, plenty of time towards the end, to just have a conversation, because I'm sure everybody's you're going to have your own thoughts and feelings about this because it's different for every agency or consultancy. So let's talk first about the daily scrums. How do daily scrums work in classic Scrum? Before I get started, everybody here knows what Scrum is, right? This is a project management BOP. We get Scrum, daily scrums, sprints, things like that. Great. So I'm not going to define it. Scrum Classic. The PO, Scrum Master, and the team all attend daily scrums. Easy. Problem is, consultancy Scrum, the client doesn't always care. All they care about is, I have a problem, I hired you people, I need it done in 4 weeks, or 4 months, or 4 years, whatever it is, just make it happen. I hired you to do a problem, to solve a problem for me, just make it happen. So we want to make sure that we include the client whenever possible. We have to accept that the client will not always attend, and we have to find a way to work around it. And that's on a case-by-case basis. So sometimes you strike a deal with the client, and you say, show up 3 times a week, or 2 times a week, or we'll send you our notes after the Scrum, or you send us your update whenever you want to send us your update, and then we're going to read aloud to the team. But make sure that they're invested in the project in some way. So the traditional notion of a product owner is a person responsible for a product, and they are guiding the roadmap, the backlog, the releases, and the iterations. So the product owner is many things, sometimes referred to as the single wringable neck of the project. If the stakeholders don't like what's happening, they can go scream at the product owner. Why didn't this solve our business goals? Why is it late? Why is there a budget? But primarily the product owner is there to carry the project goals and vision, to understand what is being done and why, and prioritize work accordingly. Because it's not up to the team to decide what should be done. It's up to the team to decide how it should be done. So the product owner understands the vision and can make hard decisions, such as this release won't have whatever killer feature everybody wants in it because there's not enough time to get it done. So they handle those difficult calls. Now when you're a consultancy, you're not really dealing with products, right? So the first thing you do is you rename them. They're not a product owner, they're a project owner. They own the project. So that sets the tone from that point forward, that everybody understands that what you're developing when you're a consultancy working on a project is not a product, but a project that is ongoing. Software and websites are never truly done. You're constantly working on them and iterating, making them better. So typically the client is not going to be some kind of a product manager. They're not necessarily going to have that background. So they are not really required to be involved in this process. The client, for example, may be less interested in profitability of features. They may be less interested in long-term roadmaps of this so-called product. As I said earlier, they primarily think that they have a project that needs to be done, and they've hired you to do it, period. Don't call me when it's ready, I'll take a look at it. I don't have to think about it, that's why I hired you. Additionally, we have decided that because of this tension now with the client, where we're asking them to take on the vision of the project and to devote a ton of time to be involved, the product owner has to be involved on a daily basis. Sometimes you assign the role of the PO to somebody on the client side if they're available. If you do, you have to train them. So a lot of Scrum teams, or big companies that implement Scrum, like Apple, Google, people like that, they do trainings. They have group trainings with all the POs. They do actual product owner certified training, things like that. You as the consultant have to train them on how to be a good PO. Can I pick on you, Paul, for a moment? I'd like to introduce Paul, who is one of our clients, who is an excellent PO. So he has been through this process of being trained on how to be an integrated and invested owner of the project. So you are responsible for the success of your project owner. Fair enough? All right, he's nodding. However, sometimes the client can't be a PO. It's either because they're way too busy, which is usually the case, or they're scared of it, or they're just annoyed that you even asked. So in those cases, you need to assign that role to somebody. You can't have a project that doesn't have a project owner. It doesn't work. Somebody has to make tough calls and vet them, period. But that person cannot also be a designer or developer in the project. So assign a project owner, but don't make it one of the designers or developers, because now you have somebody who is being pulled in two directions. They are having to make tough calls about the project. They have to understand the project vision, and then they're being asked to execute that project and work alongside everybody who they've just asked to work overtime. So make sure that these aren't the same people. They will get burnt out. Designers and developers should be designers and developers. There's some disagreement on this next point though. So according to Hoyle Scrum says, the Scrum Master should never, ever, ever also be the PM. But that's for products. And what we found is if you have a really good Scrum Master who has a background in, say, business analysis or as a technical PM or something like that, it is absolutely acceptable to assign the project owner role to the Scrum Master and have them do both. But it has to be something that the team is on board with. Because suddenly the team is thinking, there's a little bit of tension there too, because here's the Scrum Master who is their servant leader, who is there to remove blockers, to be their shoulder to cry on, to be the point of contact for the team facing the client. But now this person is also telling them that they're probably going to have to work overtime or that the client is upset about something or another. There is a little bit of tension there, so you have to set that expectation with the team that, boy, we really try to get the client to be involved and be an active PO, but nobody can do it, or they thought they could, but they don't have enough time, or they just balked at the idea. So we're going to have this really great business analysis and Scrum Master person also be this role. It depends entirely on your team, the project, and the personality of the client. So the backlog, Scrum Classic. The purpose of the backlog in Scrum Classic, the PO writes the stories that go into the backlog. The PO prioritizes the backlog, and the PO plans and releases iterations. However, if your PO is a client, sometimes that PO is really intimidated by the backlog, because that backlog is a list of things that they really want and that they think they have to have, and suddenly they're faced with, I can't have everything I want. So again, you have to train them. You have to have them understand that there are things like minimum viable products, that there are releases, that there are iterations, that there are ways that you can still deliver the value that they need, but maybe not as gold-plated. If the client can't be the PO, they need to be involved with the backlog on a regular basis. So as far as training, you want to make sure that they understand what stories are. That it's, as a role, I need to do something so that business value is provided. As a blank, I need to blank so that blank. That is a user story. They need to know how to write them. They need to know exactly what the backlog is. They need to know what prioritization means. It doesn't mean that there are 5 things that are high priority. It means that there's something that is up here, and there's something below that, and something below that, and something below that. No 2 things can ever have the same priority. And that really messes with some people's heads, because they think it's all important, but in fact, that's not really the case. So they have to understand that prioritization means everything is more or less important than something else, period. You also need to train them on what to look for when they are accepting stories. So at the sprint demo, at the end of your sprint, you need to coach them a little bit. So what we've done with some of our clients who maybe feel a little intimidated or don't really understand the process, during that first sprint, we will have an experienced project manager, scrum master, or former product owner kind of sit next to them or be on the phone and nudge them a bit and say, hey, that thing that you see on the screen, is that exactly what you wanted? Shouldn't it maybe be a little bit like that? Or is it really doing, ask them to do this and ask them to do that. This is all part of the training. You're having your team actually challenge itself by asking the product owner to ask more challenging questions. So the product owner can't simply be like, I don't really get it, sure, it's all accepted, great. And we've seen that happen. They're just, they don't understand the technology, they don't want to talk about views and panels and things like that. So we have to train them for the first few sprints to start to ask tough questions and to be challenging and to speak up, because it is their project. We need to understand, they need to understand how something is considered done when it's only a piece of that project. So understanding how a story is written and how it is therefore done. And that's negotiation. There's nothing I can explain up here that would clarify that really, except that for every story, you want to be sure that you include a demo script and a definition of done, or that you have a definition of done that expands over the entire project. So they need to understand what done means. Done doesn't mean the website's completed. Done means this one teeny tiny piece of functionality has been completed in the past 2 weeks. All right. So let's talk about what makes a good non-product owner client, or project owner client. So when you're working with a client, you want to make sure that, or rather, when you have somebody on your team who's a product owner, you need to make sure that that product owner has a deeply intimate understanding of requirements, drivers, and goals. So what are the things that have to be done to make the project successful? Why are they being done, and for what purpose? What are the goals? They have to be involved in all of the critical decisions. So are you going to go this way or that way? Which story is going to be pulled out of the backlog because we can't complete it in time? What are you going to remove from the MVP in order to hit the budget? They have to be there for that. They have to attend all the demos, they have to accept all the stories, and they have to test them immediately. They also have to be available for frequent communication. This can be really difficult sometimes because it's a lot of overhead. It's a lot of work, right? Often being involved 15 minutes every day for daily Scrum, 2 to 3 to 4 hours sometimes doing sprint planning, sprint demos, retrospectives, all of the Scrum rituals. They have to be constantly reviewing the backlog. We recommend weekly, which is more frequently than per sprint, because things change in business. So they need to make sure that the stories are constantly being prioritized so that when the next sprint begins, we as a team can simply scrape those stories off the top and begin work on them immediately, and not sit down and have to reprioritize every sprint planning after the demo. And this part is often overlooked. The PO needs to be looking at the stories at the bottom of the backlog, not just the ones that have kind of bubbled up halfway or at the top, because there might be something lurking in the bottom there that is really, really key. So they do have to review the whole thing every time, otherwise stuff will be forgotten about. There's the notion of pick two. So there are 3 things in a project. There's budget, timeline, features, or scope. So budget, timeline, features. You have to pick 2 because the other one has to flex. You can't have all 3. In Scrum Classic, you encourage the PO to pick the 2 that are most important so that the third thing can flex. So let's say that you have a very fixed budget and a very fixed timeline. Well, therefore, the thing that has to flex, if there are problems that arise during the building of this product in Scrum Classic, the functionality will have to be reduced. But if the functionality is the most important thing, and so is the budget, then you may have to extend the timeline. It's going to take you longer, or sometimes you have to compress it in order to meet a certain budget if you have overhead that's just being tacked onto each sprint. In Scrum Classic, the release backlog is fine-tuned to meet the most important of the 2, so the third can be flexible. But in Consultancy Scrum, budget is always one of the 2. They will tell you it's not, but it always, always is, because the last thing a client wants to hear is we need more money. That will never go over well, ever. So always assume that the budget is one of the 2 and ask them to pick the other one. Is it going to be timeline or functionality? And then remind them every time you're writing stories, you're doing your sprint planning, you're working on the backlog, well, budget we got to keep in mind, and then you said timeline is really important too, so what are we going to give? What are we going to give up on our features? Additionally, we found budget needs to be reviewed constantly, at least every sprint. What's your sprintly burn, right? How much money are you spending every 2 weeks, every sprint? It also helps to review it with the team, just so the team understands where everybody's at with the budget. Because when you're a consultancy, we believe in being very open about finances and budgets on projects. It's not something that we want to weigh heavily at all on the minds of the team, the designers and developers, because it's ultimately not really their responsibility. But we found that everybody would rather know than not know, than to be in the dark about budget. So just say what it is, and you don't have to harp on it. You don't have to make a big deal out of it. Just say, hey, we're about 50% of the way through the budget, but we're about 40% of the way through the functionality. What that will do is apply gentle, positive pressure to the team to say, hey, let's not gold plate so much stuff. If there's a way that we can still deliver the value of that functionality, but not necessarily heavily customize it or make it super, super slick, if we can just deliver functionality quickly, let's focus on doing that for the next couple of sprints, and then we can realign our budget and how much functionality we've been able to deliver. So we have velocity. In other words, are we actually going to make it to the end of the project? Are we going to launch on time, on budget, with everything that needs to be done? In Scrum Classic, a team is supposed to remain the same size for the duration of an entire project or release. There are 6 people on the team. There will always be 6 people on the team. There will always be these 6 people. Well, that works when you're Google and you have thousands of people working for you, and you can say these 10 people are going to work on this project from now until it's done. That's great, but as a consultancy, you have to build time. So if there are people that are sitting around not doing work because there's not enough work to do in a sprint, or if another project comes up and there's an emergency and you have to shift people, that's what you face as a consultancy. So therefore, in consultancy Scrum, this happening is extremely fluid and variable. So in one sprint, there may be 6 people on a team, or for the first 2 months of a project, there'll be 6 people on a team, and then we'll drop down to 3 as most functionality is completed or whatever. The velocity is not consistent, therefore. You don't have the same number of people on a team, so therefore your velocity, your sprint velocity, will not be equal or consistently grow. If you went from having 6 people on a team to 3, you should assume that your velocity will be cut in half. So plan for that. If you were able to complete 60 story points with a 6-person team in the previous sprint, that's about 10 points per person. So in the next sprint, when you're downsizing your team to 3 people, plan on 30, don't plan on 60. Of course, that's going to extend the number of sprints, so keep that in mind. However, you always, always, always want to retain a core team of people who have always been on that project. You can't have full turnover on a Scrum project, or on a Scrum team. So if you have 6 people, and then you pull off 3, and you add 3 more, and then you pull off the other 3, you suddenly have a brand new team. You have 6 people who have not been consistent in the project. We always have 1 or 2 people remain on the project for the life of that project. It ensures consistency of knowledge and practice. Also, there's a lot of benefits from client interaction as well. Time boxing in Scrum Classic is used to limit investigation of features. So you might say you have a research story in the backlog or a research task. We need to figure out the viability of a certain JavaScript library. Let's limit that to 2 story points or 4 hours or however you want to do it. In Consultancy Scrum, the time boxing is less about let's not waste too much of our time figuring something out, but rather let's use a chunk of time to figure out how complicated something really is. So we use research stories, and we time box them in Consultancy Scrum to be able to write more and better stories. And if something extends past that time frame, we have to have a conversation with the client. Let's say we time box a certain piece of functionality, and the client keeps coming back during the sprint as they watch what we're doing, and they say, hey, I'd really like it if it did this additional thing, or I was kind of envisioning it a slightly different way. We have to have a conversation with them at that moment to say, all right, we're not going to be able to achieve all of the stories in the sprint that we had set out to because this is taking longer than we thought. This 2-point story is now more like a 5-point story. So what are we going to take out in order to finish this, or do we stop it right now? And you have to have that conversation with the client on a regular basis. So client management in Scrum Classic, there are no clients, just stakeholders and a product that you have to deliver. So you don't have to worry about client management at all. But in consultancy, you have to meet the client's emotional needs. You have to appoint somewhere in your organization an account manager-like person who is not related directly to the project and not directly related to say the profitability of your business. So somebody who does client relations or account management or a partner in the business, something like that. That person is there to answer all of the client's questions and concerns because the PO is kind of the bad guy in the relationship. The PO is always going back to the client saying, can't do that, not enough time, you don't have enough money, we're going to have to limit the scope here, what are you going to take out of the sprint? They're always the one delivering rough news. So when the client has a problem or wants to check in, they want to talk to somebody who's not really involved in that day-to-day, that constant negotiation. So you actually need to create 2 points of contact. You need to have a product owner type person, and you need to have an account manager type person. One fulfills the needs of the projects, the other fulfills the needs of the relationship. In product, internally facing Scrum, that relationship doesn't matter. That everybody's working for the same company, everybody has the same goal. But when you're a vendor, you have to be very aware of the emotional needs that are involved. In Scrum, there's this notion of continuous integration, pair programming, peer reviews, all of those good practices, right? And in Scrum Classic, these are really important supporting practices that make for really good code and really good projects. Same thing, keep it up. That is super, super, super important. Peer reviews, we do code reviews on every commit. So we do something, to get into the technical stuff for just a moment, we do something called feature branching. So every story on a project has a feature branch in GitHub. So somebody takes a story off the backlog. It says, as a user, I need to log in so that I can post content on the site and demonstrate engagement for that client. For that client. That's story number 72. So now we have a feature branch in GitHub that is story 72. Everybody does the thin vertical slice work related to that, all the theming, all the configuration changes, all of the server tuning, all the stuff that needs to be done, code that needs to be written, modules that need to be installed or set up. And then they commit that. But then there's one person on the team who is the gatekeeper of the code. So everybody does pull requests, meaning, hey, I've got work, and it's ready to go into the main code base. But there's one person who reviews absolutely everything as it goes in. And ideally, that's one of those people who's been on the project for the life of the project. So they know the entire code base inside and out. And they're making sure that nobody does anything, because if people are working on multiple stories simultaneously, they don't do anything that's going to conflict with one another when it's finally all merged into trunk, which is the main code base.
So does that happens for every single little change that somebody does, or per feature?
Every story.
Every story.
Yeah, so it's neither every change nor every feature, but it's rather every story.
Okay.
That way you can also, you can demo every story much more accurately, because you simply switch to this code branch and you say, we've done only this story in this code branch. We're going to demo it. And there's much less risk of all of that code conflicting with other code that's been done in that sprint. Ideally, though, before your demo, you want to merge all of your code together and do one last pass so that it's all working seamlessly and you don't suddenly run into a problem after the demo. Ready backlog. So in Scrum Classic, a fully formed backlog is only necessary for releases. So per release, you write, size, prioritize all of the stories in the backlog for that release. In Consultancy Scrum, you need to do that for the entire project, not just the MVP, not just phase one. Somebody's clapping, thank you. Not just phase one, or phase one and phase two, the entire project. It takes forever, but it's going to save you from going 50 or 100% over budget in the end. It's going to really annoy the entire team and the client up front. But once you have a fully formed, complete, prioritized, size backlog, you know exactly how big the project is. You know that this project is 2,000 story points. So if you're doing if you have a sprint velocity of 200 points, you're going to get it done in 10 sprints. What's your sprintly burn? $20,000. It's going to cost $200,000. You know immediately what it's going to be. If you are writing your stories as every sprint ends, and then just because, oh, the backlog's empty, fill it up, write some more stories. I mean, you're just burning money at that point. You have no idea how much it's actually going to cost. That will absolutely ruin your month and maybe year. Additionally, define the MVP as early as possible. So once you have a fully complete size prioritized backlog, you actually can define an MVP. MVP, of course, minimum viable product. The minimum amount of functionality that is considered viable to that client. That requires a lot of conversation. So a client has a grand vision of what they want to do. They're going to do something really big, lots of functionality. But what do they really need by August 1st? What do they really need? Oh, brochure, we're in a blog. Great, so we can iterate. One of the core tenets of Scrum, of course, is to release early and often, demonstrate value early and often, get feedback early and often, and constantly adjust the project to the changing needs of the business and their audience and their customers. Getting an MVP out there as quickly as possible allows you to do that. So then there's a contract, sometimes called the scope of work, or a statement of work, or a purchase order, or something like that. In Scrum Classic, they're not really necessary because you're working with an internal team, unless you have some kind of complicated structure where one division has to contract another, and that happens a lot at universities. There really aren't contracts at all. You're all one company under one umbrella working on one thing with one goal. But when you're a consultant, the contract is everything. The contract defines if something goes wrong, the first thing that gets pulled out of the door is a contract. But you said here was going to do this. Yeah, but we're Scrum, right? Things change. So you have to make sure that your contract and your scope of work allow for changes in the plan and the timing of features. We have language in our MSA, Master Service Agreement, that says we're going to do everything agilely. That means there will not be change orders. That means that often the direction of the project will change based on a conversation. And that's what we mean by agile methods. We define it in our contracts. Additionally, you will want to have appropriately vague descriptions in your statement of work. You want to talk more about what is trying to be achieved than what will actually be done. So you want to talk about, we are going to build something that will allow you to communicate with your constituency in a way that makes most sense to them. Not, we're going to integrate Twitter in a very specific way and allow Facebook login, and then you can post to Instagram and all of that stuff. Because what if Instagram gets bought by Facebook, and then they change their terms of service in such a way that they can no longer upload their photos to it, because now Instagram and Facebook owns all of it? Well, do you want to go back and write a change order every time that happens? That's kind of crazy, right? Additionally, though, you do need to document all the agreed to changes. So yes, you have conversations in the hallway. Yeah, you're talking in IM and you say, let's do this instead of that, but you have to document that. Because people forget. People are going to forget that they said something or they meant something or whatever. So you do still need to document it. You need to be safe. You know, practice safe Scrum. So I have this little structure diagram that I want to walk through. And then that's the end of my talk for now. And then we can just chat about whatever concerns you have. Because every organization is different, every client is different. These are just some of the changes that we've made to, that we implement more often than not. So this is sort of our structure here. Here are 2 main points of contact. So blue means client, green means 4 kitchens. We have the client. The client is talking to the product owner. The product owner may be somebody within the client. It may be somebody at 4 kitchens. The client, they're the stakeholders. They're the ones that say, we have a mandate to fulfill certain fundraising requirements by the end of the year. And we have decided that a website is the best way to do that. And here is a vision that we have articulated. They pass that vision down to the product owner, who then embodies that vision. And that product owner says, okay, well, I can't get a hold of the client this week because they're on vacation. We have to make a tough decision about, do we do A or do we do B? I know that this is their goal, and I feel that if we do B, that's going to best address that goal. So that person is empowered to make those kinds of decisions. The product owner is then communicating with the Scrum Master and therefore the team. The product owner is the one saying, here's what you're going to do the next sprint. Here's how everything is prioritized. If you have any questions, come see me. I'm going to take a look at all the stories before they're demoed to the stakeholders, and I will define them as done, and then we'll do a formal walkthrough with the client. The client, however, also needs to be able to access somebody that isn't always telling them no, right? They need to talk to somebody about the needs of the overall project. If, for example, we have a personality conflict, if the product owner is somebody from an organization who it turns out doesn't really get along that much with the client, just for whatever reason, sometimes people don't really click, that needs to be communicated in some way. It can't be communicated to the person that they don't click with. You know, that's not going to be a pleasant conversation. They need somebody else to go to. Or if this client has a bunch of new work that they want to do, like, hey, there's a new project on the horizon. If they go to the product owner, that product owner is going to say, well, we're working on this right now. You want me to throw all that stuff in the backlog? Are we changing scope? Like, what are we doing? They need to have somebody else they can go to say, hey, there's a new project. Let's talk about it like a new project. Let's not confuse it with the one we're already working on. Sound good? Any questions about that? All right. Rock and roll. So, any thoughts? Are we crazy? Yes, sir.
Not crazy. No, that's a really good talk. Thank you very much for that. Where can you talk a little bit more about where in consultancy Scrum where the project manager fits in? Right? Because I know in Scrum there's no such thing as, or there's no role, official title of project manager. So in our agency we always struggle to map that project manager into Agile. So they often take on the role of Scrum Master, but personally I don't find it's been working out so well.
So the question is, what is the role of a project manager as it is traditionally defined in this kind of structure? Is that basically it?
No, it is, in your experience, recommendations for how a project manager can fit into the Scrum methodology in consultancy.
Got it. So how can a project manager fit into this kind of structure in consultancy?
Or what role do they play in the methodology?
They could do a lot of different things, and it depends on each person, honestly. So I actually don't have a lot of experience working with traditional project managers. I would say that project managers who are really good at delegation, at logistics, at clearing roadblocks and blockers and keeping a team focused, that's a good Scrum Master. Because a Scrum Master is, according to the parlance of Scrum, a servant leader. They are there to sort of lead the team, but really serve the team. So when the team needs something, they're not getting the documents they need from the client, or there aren't enough people on the team, or there are too many people on the team, or whatever it is, they communicate that to the Scrum Master. So there's a little bit of traditional project management wrapped up in that, but sometimes a project manager might be better as a product owner. So the kinds of project managers that are, sometimes they're called technical PMs, sometimes they're called business analysts, analysts. Sometimes they, those are the two terms that come to mind.
But that's pretty good. So one of the hats I wear at the company is a business analyst, right? So I often take on the role of product owner, but it's like you said, right? As soon as you start getting into management of the iron triangle, that's sort of like a traditional PM role. So then it's like, I don't know, it's when it gets confusing, right? So you have your business analyst sort of acting as your product owner, but then they're taking on management of scope, which is traditionally the PM role, and then you have your PM involved, and then trying to act as Scrum Master, but they're used to direct.
So we need to change the language there, though.
Yeah,
you can't think of it like the product owner is interacting with the project manager. There is no project manager. Gone.
But there
so
is.
We have a product owner and a Scrum Master.
But there is a project manager because does Eddie, so in your consultancy you don't have project managers?
We call them project managers, but they fill either role. There's a difference between title and role.
Yeah.
Right? So somebody might be called in an organization project manager because they do a lot of that kind of stuff. But these are about roles. There's nobody at Core Kitchens called an account manager, but there's a role called account manager.
Gotcha.
It could be me, it could be Aaron, it could be one of our other Scrum Masters, it could be our Director of Client Relations. So we shouldn't conflate this stuff with title, with something that's on somebody's business card.
Right.
So a project manager, depending on their personality and the type of work and the personality of the client as well, a project manager could be a really good product owner, or they could be a really good Scrum Master, but they need to have that kind of flexibility. So honestly, they should be trained in both, and it's important that they be trained in both so they know where the other role is coming from, right? So they can say, hey, the team really needs this. The product owner is like, I understand what that's like. I'm a Scrum Master on this other project. I get it, right? Does that help?
I think it's still like there's no magic answer for it, right? It's just more, and it's like you said, it depends a lot on personalities and the project itself and the personality of the client. It's just, so the struggle that I have in my organization is that, so I'm a CSPO, but we don't have a lot of our project managers who have a lot of experience with Agile, right? So I'm trying to train them in it, and it's proved challenging because a lot of them come from waterfall PM where they're used to controlling the project, and then so somebody asking them to take on the role of a Scrum Master is often very hard. So then maybe, like you said, maybe they fit better into a product owner role, but then they're not used to managing backlog and shifting around.
It's a training issue.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a totally different way to do projects.
Yeah.
Fundamentally. Yes. Yeah, did you have a follow-up for
I
him?
did. Well, part of what you were talking about, who owns the iron triangle, who's responsible for it. Like in our teams, we keep it very open within the team, and like you were saying with the client, so everybody knows what the two fixed and the one flexible are. And so what happens, instead of having that one person that's like controlling, who has that responsibility, yeah, we have like responsibility is like either the consultancy owners or the account managers to actually take care of the budget, but everybody owns responsibility of the iron triangle, right? So like that old PM thing is the only one worried about that? No, it's a really, especially in consultancy firms where it's, you gotta, you get paid for the time you do and the quality of the work you put out, so everybody has to take ownership of it. I don't know if you guys do that. It sounds like you guys do that.
It depends, mostly, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes?
I have a question on how you organize yourself internally with different projects at the same time.
Mm.
So I think from a development point of view, it's really easy to focus a team on one project and to get it done as fast as possible, or like just to keep one developer or several developers on the same project for quite some time, finish it, and then go to the next project.
Yep.
With these sprints, it's different, right? You have in one project you might be a site builder would need like 2 days, and then for a special story, and for a project in parallel, you would also need that site builder, so he's working on 2 or 3 projects at the same time.
Yep.
And
how do we do that?
how do you do that?
Okay.
And
So
how did you also move to that? Maybe
sure.
transformation.
I could talk about that for another hour. So the question is resource allocation and planning. How do you do that as a consultancy in Scrum, where you don't have dedicated teams? So very high level overview. First I'll talk a little bit about what we do, and then I'll talk about a really interesting idea that Aaron and I saw at a company here in Portland called Instrument. Okay, first, how do we do it? It is a painful process and it takes hours every week. So we have a dedicated person, our director of technology, Mike Nienkerk. His job is to be a technical consultant, to ensure the professional health and development of the entire team, and to plan all of the resources. There is a 3-hour resource planning meeting every Monday morning, where he and the project managers, which are both product owners or scrum masters or a whole bunch of different people, and our director of client relations sit in a room with this big crazy spreadsheet and try and figure out who's going to be doing what. And it changes constantly. One rule we have is that nobody works on more than 2 projects. There's way too much time, it's the task switching involved in hopping from one project to another is really difficult to get into flow on a project. Sometimes it can take a whole afternoon if you're switching from one project to the other. So we don't want that happening on 3 or 4 different projects. It's very inefficient. So nobody works on more than 2 projects. Things constantly change, and we have to take into account things like this. We have 8 people attending Portland. So that's 8 people out of a 15-person shop that are not working right now. We have to build that into our schedule. Everybody has to be aware of that. So Scrum, at the beginning of every sprint, you're supposed to say who's available, what's everybody's availability for this sprint, right? Well, this person's out half a week on vacation, or I'm going to be gone the entire time, or whatever it is. And you have a plan for that. So you're going to have to decrease your velocity, your anticipated velocity, based on the number of people who are actually available. We have to do the same thing about people being split on projects. Whenever possible, though, we want people to be fully dedicated to a project. But projects have certain, the needs of a project have relatively predictable flows. So a lot of the design type stuff and content strategy and things like that tends to happen up front. And then development, and then deployment and server stuff. So there's a bit of a life cycle that follows the design and development process that can then be laid over a team. So, okay, you start over here with your design and content strategy and IA and look and feel, and you establish some of that. Now you start to implement things. Now you're developing, and the designers come back for a little while and do some adjustments, and then vertical slices of the blog and whatever. And then you deploy, and then you have your systems administrators who then push it live.
Sorry, short that happens over several sprints?
Several sprints. Yeah, we're talking this could be weeks or months. So we know that there's something, we kind of plan for that. So we know that we need to load a project with more designers and strategists at the beginning of a project and at the end. So we can predict that a little bit. Resourcing is a major problem for all consultancies. And it's extremely difficult and confusing. There's a really interesting tool that's being worked on by an organization that's actually attending here. They're called Ricochet Consulting. They're working on a project called Pushpin Planner. You should check it out. They would love feedback. It's really interesting. It takes, we used to do everything in this really ugly Google spreadsheet where every week was a column and every person is a row, and we just block out what they're doing. And it looks kind of like this really weird Gantt chart kind of thing. Pushpin Planner is really great because it takes that idea, but it's a lot more granular than 15 hours per person per project per week, up max of 2 projects. Interesting thing to look at. The second part was I want to talk about a totally different way to do this. So most consultancies are doing it like that or something like that to different degrees of disorganization, right? Another really interesting way to do it is, we had a team-wide conversation about this and decided we were too small to implement this yet. But if we were a 30-person company or something, we might be able to pull this off. You create fully dedicated teams. And fully dedicated teams work on multiple clients. And they work on only those clients, and only those clients are with only those teams. So you split your company into multiple companies. Now you have a 30-person shop. You have 3 person teams. And these 10 people are working on those 4 projects. And these 10 people are working on those 4 projects. And they are constantly working together. And usually you even seat them together so that they can have conversations and they can bounce ideas back and forth. This company, Instrument in Portland, they do this. I think their team sizes are 15 or 20 or something like that. They're a 70-person shop, and they swear by this. Now, as a result, every team has to have what they call, I think, an executive producer.
Yeah.
So they have an executive producer who oversees each team, and they're essentially a mixture of account managers for all of the clients that are part of that team, and they're monitoring the project health. They're kind of overseeing essentially a mini company inside of a company.
Yeah, I actually worked with Instrument for a big long project with Nike, and they were wonderful. Yeah, and we had 2 agile-based types of teams, and it worked really, really well. And yeah, it's cool. They do good things, so I'm glad you guys talked to them. So.
Jacob?
We're at 37 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So that actually breaks down if you have multiple locations. It still works, but it's going to destroy profitability completely. So if you have everybody in like one location, it's fine. But we are in 8 countries and fairly distributed for this reason. So it's not going to work in that case. We've tried it and it was like
having dedicated teams. Is it because of the logistics of not being?
Because of you need to be able to mix the people between teams and between countries. Otherwise, you're going to have people on the bench, and other people are customers are waiting. You have nobody available internally, and at the same time, you have 20 people or 30 people on the bench in a company. That's the problem with this. So it may work or it may not work. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. We haven't done it ourselves, but I'm intrigued by it. Yes, sir.
Interesting is that you said that one person works on one story. How do you handle, especially Drupal, that site building, backend, or theming is itself really hard, that nobody can do all the 3 people?
Well, I go back to the original rules of Scrum, which is the hardcore Scrum handbook says that the entire team should swarm on one story until it's done, and then everybody go into this other story. But the fact is, I've never actually seen that happen well. So you really get kind of clumps of people. You get 1 person working on this story, and 2 people working on that story, and 3 people working on that. And then as they finish it, they'll move around organically from task to task. We don't split it up 1 person per story. It's whoever needs to be involved. So we're doing thin vertical slices as much as possible. And by that I mean, as a user, I need to visit the blog. So that means you have to make a content type, you have to theme it, You have to build in Twitter integration or commenting or something, so you have all these roles working on this one story. But there are, of course, on an hour-to-hour and day-to-day basis, there's work that only one person can do at any given time. The themer has to go in and theme, and once the themer's done, then I can go in and do my thing. And there's some pair programming that you can do around that to speed it up, but sometimes it doesn't make sense, so you have to remain really flexible.
So who splits up the story? Like I, as a visitor, have to use the blog. Who splits it up in tasks? Is it the team?
The team. The team has to be self-organizing.
And it's completely self-organized?
Yes. It is not the role of the Scrum Master or the product owner or anybody to tell individuals what to do. The goal of Scrum is simply to say, this is what we need to do in the next 2 weeks, go do it. Let me know if you have any problems, and I'll try and solve them.
Yeah, so each story generally has like a lead person who's kind of like in charge of like owning that story. But often they'll be like, hey, Jared, I need to help, theming this thing, like pass it over to you. And whether they want to like do that kind of informally and just like, okay, here's my feature branch, you check it out, you theme it, and let me know when you're ready. Can happen informally like that, or if they want to, if it's a really big and complicated story, and they want to be a little bit more tactical on it, they'll use our project management tools to like create subtasks of that story if they want to kind of like get more granular with it, and like assign specific components to a thing that might have multiple developers touching it.
And that worked really well for us too, especially when a story had a very complex kind of life cycle and lots of different elements. And having that one story owner to help ferry it along helped get everybody going and going like, oh, hey, keep it moving, because sometimes it'll get stale if the handoff didn't happen nicely between steps or subtasks. So if something doesn't have an owner really, then it just kind of gets forgotten along the way.
Yeah, our tool kind of forces everything to have an owner, so it kind of like forces that accountability into it, which is good.
So we're almost out of time. We have time for one more question. Let's follow up maybe afterwards, but I'm sorry, in the back of the room here, sorry, Danny.
Do you write stories for the things like at the beginning, including graphic design, style tiles, wireframes that are really kind of overarching for the entire project? Do you write user stories for that, and if so, like what do they say? And that's what we
Yeah. So that's this is where Scrum gets kind of interesting, because according to Hoyle Scrum says that there are no technical stories. There should never be a story that says, as a developer, I need to configure the server so that we can launch the site. Right? That's supposed to be a task, or that's part of some other bigger story. But I mean, let's be real. Those are things that need to be done, and whether you call them tasks or stories or whatever is a constant debate, even within our organization. So something like that is a task or is it a story, because it's not actually delivering business value, right? And it's not addressing an actual user, it's addressing the needs of the client or of the team. So some people are really strict about it, and they say if your story is addressing the needs of the team, it's not a story, it's a task.
Sure.
tasks are within story.
Some people, what's that about chores?
Scrum would call it a chore.
Okay, chores. There you go.
But aren't technical tasks subs of each story? Or you'll have technical tasks outside of stories?
You can break them out that way. Lead, Scrum, chores have like no point value or ideal payment, or you can estimate it that way, but it's just usually avoided if you can. So there's no whole business value except for business value that applies to the team.
There's a business value in having a consistent look and feel.
Of course.
Is that different?
But
absolutely.
But it's absolutely subjective to.
This is exactly the argument. So this plays itself out constantly. And you just have to agree, like for this project, we're going to say that those are stories. That's it. That's what we're going to do, right? Sometimes
I was totally
you say
missing something, and I just
no.
So
this is one of the big debates in Scrum. Is exactly what you touched on. So we're out of time right now. I'm going to be outside if anybody wants to keep talking, but thank you very much.